Hey guys, picture this. You're the last passenger on a creaking, moonlit vessel that smells like salty seaweed and stale coffee, and the only thing louder than the waves is the tiny alarm in your head reminding you you've got to snooze before the sunrise. Before we set sail, smash that like button if you love a good nighttime escape, and drop a comment with the weirdest dream you've ever had. Yes, the one where you're late for a meeting with a talking llama. Dim the lights, get cozy, maybe wrap a blanket tighter than your Wi-Fi signal in a dead zone, and let's cue the gentle lull of the hull rocking you like a dad's bad jokes at a family dinner. You hear the deck plank sigh under your weight, feel the cool night breeze whispering, sleep is coming into your ear, and suddenly the whole world feels as calm as a silent inbox. Ever notice how bedtime feels like waiting for a load of updates at 2 a.m.? Only the install is a wave of plush, drifting slumber. So grab that pillow, close those restless eyes, and let the dream ship set course for the softest, most absurdly relaxing night you've ever charted. Trust me, it's smoother than a TikTok trend gone viral. Ready, let's drift. When the sun pulled its last golden thread behind the crumbling lighthouse, the ancient harbor sighed a salty lullaby. Lanterns flickered like fireflies trapped in glass jars, casting jittery shadows on the cobblestones. Lyra, a wiry girl with a knot of ink-black hair, slipped past the fishmonger's stalls, inhaling a cocktail of seaweed, roasted chestnuts, and the faint tang of old rope. The air hummed with distant oars and the occasional gull's cackle, as if the night itself were rehearsing a choir of sighs. She felt the tug of destiny, like a mischievous cat pawing at the hem of her coat. Beyond the dock, half submerged in a veil of moonlit mist, the dream ship rose like a mythic leviathan made of glass and moonbeams. Its hull shimmered with a pearlescent sheen, reflecting the sky's bruised violet and the occasional twinkling star that dared to dip its toe into the water. Lyra brushed her fingertips against the cold, slick wood and heard a faint, melodic creak that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby humming from a distant nursery. The scent of damp pine and a whisper of ozone tickled her nose, reminding her of thunderstorms that never quite arrived. She laughed, half in awe, half in disbelief, wondering if she'd stumbled onto a set of a fantasy movie, perhaps a low-budget Pirates of the Caribbean sequel. From the shadowed bow stepped Captain Morwen, a figure draped in a coat stitched from midnight clouds and peppered with silver constellations. Her eyes glowed like twin lanterns, and she greeted Lyra with a grin that hinted at secrets older than the harbor's oldest tavern. "Welcome aboard," she crooned, her voice as smooth as aged rum but with a hint of mischief. "We're about to chart the seas of sleep, where even the most restless mind finds a dock." Morwen's laugh rang like a bell struck by a drunken sailor, and she tossed Lyra a brass compass that spun wildly, pointing not north but toward dreams. The captain's promise felt both comforting and absurd, like being offered a pillow made of clouds by a dragon. The crew, a motley assortment of sleepy-eyed cats, a retired sea serpent, and a lanky intern who kept muttering about deadlines, welcomed Lyra with nods and the occasional snort of sea foam. The deck smelled of warm wool, stale coffee, and a faint hint of lavender, an odd but soothing blend that made even the most jittery thoughts melt like butter on a hot skillet. As the dream ship slipped silently into the phosphorescent tide, the water glowed beneath them like a giant, gentle night light. Lyra felt the hull's gentle sway lull her heartbeat, and the wind whispered jokes about the captain's uncanny ability to navigate without a map. "I'm basically the GPS of the subconscious," Morwen teased. The night air wrapped around them like a cozy blanket, promising a voyage that would tuck restless minds into the softest of slumbers. Soon the harbor faded into a watercolor smear of indigo and silver, and the dream ship glided into the realm where dreams and reality blur like a badly edited Instagram filter. Lyra stared at the horizon, where constellations danced like disco lights at a 1970s club, and she could swear she heard distant snoring from a distant island of forgotten nap pods. The captain raised a toast with a goblet of moon milk, declaring, "To voyages that end before the alarm clock rings." Lyra laughed, feeling the irony of seeking sleep on a ship that never truly docked. As the ship's bell told a soft, hypnotic rhythm, the world slipped away, and the night promised a night's worth of peace for every weary soul aboard. Lyra stepped onto the deck as if she were a conductor before a symphony of stars, her boots splashing in the phosphorescent tide. The crew unfurled the dream ship's sails, each panel woven from silken night clouds that shimmered like moon-kissed cobwebs. As the cloth caught the breeze, the wind sang soft lullabies, humming a bedtime ballad that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby from a 90s cartoon. The scent of fresh rain and distant pine mingled with the salty brine, making the air feel like a freshly laundered blanket tossed onto a dock. Even the grizzled helmsman cracked a grin, muttering that the only thing missing was a cup of cocoa strong enough to wake a dragon. With a creak that could have been a pirate's sigh, the dream ship slipped from the harbor, its hull gliding over water that mirrored forgotten dreams like shattered, stained glass. The surface rippled with phantom images, childhood forts, first kisses, the taste of a long-lost candy, each flicker tugging at the passengers' hearts. A gentle pull of relaxation settled over the crowd, as if invisible hands were massaging their shoulders with warm, invisible mittens. Yet beneath the soothing swell, a few uneasy thoughts bobbed like stray barnacles, whispering, "Are we really sailing toward sleep, or just drifting into a snooze-fueled abyss?" Lyra laughed, waving a lantern that flickered like a firefly on a caffeine-addicted night, assuring them that doubts were merely the ship's way of checking its compass. The deck's wood, rough as an old pirate's beard, scraped against the soles of the crew, sending tiny splinters of memory into the air. Somewhere nearby, a gull squawked a tune that sounded oddly like the theme from Star Wars, as if the galaxy itself were cheering them on. The salty spray kissed the faces of the travelers, leaving a briny tang that tasted like the ocean's own toothpaste, minty, a bit abrasive but oddly comforting. One passenger, a nervous scholar, clutched a notebook filled with half-finished poems, the pages fluttering like nervous butterflies in a hurricane. The ship's galley released a waft of sizzling seaweed chips, a smell so pungent it could have cleared a tavern full of rowdy brawlers, yet somehow made the crew feel more at home. As the vessel cut through the night, Lyra shouted, "All hands on deck, this is the Millennium Falcon of nap time, and we're about to make the Kessel run in 12 minutes of shut-eye." The irony was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. They were sailing toward a destination that existed only when the mind decided to turn off the lights. A mischievous kelp monster, looking like a seaweed-covered Elvis, performed a jitterbug on the hull, its neon green limbs flashing in the moonlight. The crew chuckled, wiping sweat, more like the sticky residue of melted cheese, from their foreheads, while a lone rat scurried across the deck, dragging a half-eaten cheese puff that left a sour, cheesy trail. Even the ship's compass spun wildly, pointing not north, but toward the warm, fuzzy feeling of a blanket fort built inside a teenager's bedroom. By the time the dream ship reached the horizon of slumber, the passengers felt as if they'd been wrapped in a giant, humming quilt stitched from the size of ancient storytellers. Their eyes grew heavy, lids drooping like wilted roses after a storm, and the doubts that had bobbed earlier now floated away like soggy popcorn in a river. Lyra whispered a final blessing, her voice a buttery whisper that tasted like warm caramel on a cold night. The ship's bell tolled once, a soft ding that sounded suspiciously like the notification ping of a smartphone announcing bedtime mode. And as the night cloud sails billowed, the crew settled into a rhythm so soothing that even the most restless mind would have to admit defeat, surrendering to the sweet, inevitable pull of dreams. The dream ship, a creaking wooden leviathan, cut through moonlit foam when the sky suddenly cracked like an old vinyl record under an impatient DJ. A sudden tempest roared in, hurling swirling worries that looked like neon-lit smoke rings from a malfunctioning carnival. The deck shivered under the weight of fragmented memories that clattered like clumsy tin soldiers marching to a broken marching band. Even the ship's figurehead, a solemn mariner with a beard of sea salt, seemed to sigh as thunder growled a tired lullaby. All the while, the scent of wet canvas and old coffee mingled with the electric tang of anxiety. Captain Serenity, who claimed she once outsnored a hurricane, barked orders with the urgency of a barista during the morning rush. The crew, a ragtag band of dream weavers and sand-dusty librarians, scrambled to secure the mainsail of hope while the wind howled like a disgruntled audience at a midnight movie marathon. Echoes of the day's anxieties slammed against the hull. The missed deadline screamed like a paparazzo flash. The awkward text message buzzed as a mischievous poltergeist. Yet each chuckle, each snort, cut through the gloom like a well-timed meme, reminding the sailors that even storms need a punchline. The galley's stew bubbled with a spicy, comforting aroma that fought the cold dampness of doubt. From the deck rose lanterns of calm breath, glowing amber and pulsing with the rhythm of slow, deliberate inhales. The crew inhaled deep, drawing in the salty air and exhaling the day's static, turning each breath into a luminous tether for the ship. With every exhale, the tempest's roar softened, like a rock star turning down the volume after a wild solo. The light flickered, casting shadows that danced like jittery sprites, yet the shadows never touched the passengers' souls, keeping their feet firmly anchored in peace. A subtle scent of lavender and old books drifted, coaxing the mind to untangle knotted thoughts into tidy, sail-shaped bundles. Passengers, half asleep and half awake, clutched their pillows like talismans, giggling at the absurdity of fighting a storm made of their own mental laundry. One whispered, "If this were a Netflix binge, I'd hit pause," and the crew responded with a conspiratorial wink, as if they'd hidden the remote in the galley. The ship's hull sang a low hum reminiscent of a lullaby hummed by grandmothers in sitcoms, grounding the weary travelers. Even the deck swabbers slipped on a puddle of spilled tea, splashing a frothy cascade that made everyone chuckle, reminding them that a bit of mess can be oddly comforting. Through humor and irony, the crew turned the tempest into a theatrical farce, letting the passengers float on a sea of calm chuckles. As the last thunderous echo faded, the sky cleared, revealing a tapestry of twinkling stars that resembled sequins on a gala dress. The dream ship glided onward, its sails now billowing with the soft breath of midnight breezes, as if the storm had been nothing more than a mischievous dream sprinkle. The crew lowered the lanterns, letting them sink like tiny moons into the dark water, each one a reminder that calm lives within the chest of anyone who dares to breathe. The passengers, now cradled in serenity, drifted into a deeper slumber, their worries dissolved like sugar in tea. And so, with a gentle creak and a sigh of gratitude, the ship sailed onward toward horizons where only sweet, untroubled dreams await. When the clock struck the witching hour, the tempest that had battered the dream ship's canvas finally sighed its last, jagged breath. Lightning cracked like the applause of an angry god, scattering silver shards across the ink-black sky. From that chaos, a luminous constellation unfurled, an ancient map of twinkling pearls that seemed to have been stitched by the night herself. The crew felt the pull of those stars, as if a celestial GPS whispered, "Turn left, avoid the kraken, and follow the silver thread." Captain Aurelius, with a beard as bristly as a Viking's battle helm, barked orders, his voice cutting through the wind like a saber. Beside him, Lyra, the ship's lyrical compass, lifted her harp, its strings humming the scent of fresh rain on dusty parchment. Together they launched a chorus of soothing verses, each note a warm blanket thrown over the shivering timbers. Even the storm's remnants, droplets that smelled of ozone and old fish guts, seemed to retreat, curling into the hull like frightened cats. The crew, half wondering if they'd accidentally tuned into a Disney soundtrack, chuckled, their tension melting like butter on a skillet. The verses rode the wind, weaving through the rigging with the elegance of a ballerina on a ship's mast. Every syllable tasted of honeyed mint, while the deck beneath their boots grew warm, as if the wood had been baked in a medieval bakery. Lyra's voice rose, painting images of moonlit meadows where fireflies performed synchronized light shows. Think Star Wars Cantina, but without the cantina. A sudden gust tossed a sack of seaweed across the deck, releasing a pungent, briny perfume that made some sailors gag, then laugh, then gasp in awe. The ship's timbers creaked in answer, a low, resonant moan that sounded oddly like a grand piano playing a lullaby in a haunted castle. Guided by the constellation's steady glow, the dream ship slipped into the sea of tranquil echoes, a water plane that shivered with the size of 1,000 sleeping realms. The sea's surface mirrored the night sky, each ripple a soft whisper that smelled faintly of lavender and old library cards. Captain Aurelius steered with a steady hand, his eyes reflecting the same stars that once rattled the hull, now calm as a monk on a yoga retreat. Lyra's final verse rose like a phoenix, its cadence breaking the last vestiges of tension and scattering them like confetti at a medieval wedding. The ship glided, its sails billowing with a breeze that felt like the cool side of a pillow after a sweaty summer day. As the dream ship settled into the heart of the echoing sea, a hush settled over the deck, thick as the silence before a thunderclap. Crew members slumped into hammocks that smelled of warm wool and caramelized campfire ash, their breaths sinking with the gentle lap of waves. Even the stars above seemed to hum, each twinkle a tiny lullaby humming the tune of a forgotten bedtime story. Captain Aurelius whispered a final, cheeky salute. May your dreams be as epic as a Marvel finale, and as calm as a monk on a mountaintop, before his eyes closed. The dream ship, cradled by the sea of tranquil echoes, drifted onward into a realm of deep, restorative sleep, leaving behind only the faint scent of pine needles and the echo of a satisfied sigh. The first amber fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, coaxing the dream ship to a gentle sigh as it slipped into the calm harbor of the Isle of Restful Horizons. The hull creaked like an old wooden pirate tavern, but the sea's lullaby soothed every rivet. Lanterns flickered out, their waxy glow giving way to the gold of sunrise, while gulls squawked a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a bad karaoke version of Here Comes the Sun. A thin veil of mist lifted, revealing a pier stitched from driftwood and dreams, ready to receive weary travelers. The ship's bronze prow kissed the dock with the delicacy of a cat's whisper. Passengers peeled themselves from the buttery-soft berths as if emerging from a giant, fragrant loaf of fresh bread, the smell of distant coffee and sea salt mingling in their noses. They blinked against the light, stretched limbs that had been curled tighter than a pretzel, and inhaled the salty air that tasted like ozone mixed with the faint perfume of night-blooming jasmine. One elderly gentleman coughed up a phantom sea foam mustache, while a child giggled, clutching a plush starfish that squirted tiny droplets of water onto his chin. The deckhand handed out steaming mugs, their steam curling like ghostly ribbons, and the clink of porcelain sang a tiny symphony of wakefulness. Even the ship's old compass, dented and stubborn, seemed to cheer, its needle wobbling like a caffeinated metronome. Lyra, the ship's resident dream weaver, perched on the railing, her eyes reflecting the sunrise like twin marbles of molten amber. She mused on the voyage's lessons, recalling how the night's darkness had taught her to navigate not just seas, but the tangled corridors of the mind, much like trying to find the remote in a couch filled with popcorn. With a grin, she whispered that the only thing scarier than a nightmare was a Wi-Fi outage on a ghost ship, a joke that even the grizzled captain chuckled at. She noted that the soft hum of the engine had been a lullaby, but the real music lay in the passengers' sighs, which rose and fell like a choir of contented cats. In that moment, Lyra felt the island's gentle breeze slap her cheek, a reminder that even the most ethereal journeys have a concrete dock. The captain, a wiry man with a beard that could double as a ship's rope, stepped forward, his boots thudding against the planks like a marching band on a sugar rush. He tipped his battered hat, the brim wobbling like a bobblehead, and declared, "Our sails will furl for now, but remember, dear travelers, the night's curtain is always ready to rise when a weary heart calls." His voice carried the gravitas of a Shakespearean soliloquy mixed with the swagger of a modern superhero announcing a sequel. He handed each passenger a tiny silver compass shaped like a teacup, joking that it would point them toward the nearest pillow, not north. With a final wink, he turned to the ship, whispering, "Sleep tight, my floating oasis, until the moon is hungry again." As the dream ship's lanterns dimmed, the island's chorus of crickets swelled, sounding suspiciously like a low-budget version of the Star Wars Cantina band, complete with clattering beetle bass. The air grew cooler, and the scent of damp earth rose, reminding everyone that even paradise has a gritty, mossy underbelly. Lyra tucked a feathered bookmark into her journal, promising to return for the next nocturnal adventure, because, as any seasoned night owl knows, the best stories are the ones that begin with a yawn. The captain's silhouette faded into the sunrise, leaving behind a trail of golden foam that smelled faintly of toasted marshmallows. So, whenever a heart feels as tangled as a headphone cord, just listen for the distant echo of a ship's sigh, its promise that the calm of night is never truly out of reach. In the quiet cove of Lunastrand, the moon draped the water like a silver shawl, and the wind whispered secrets through kelp-tangled reeds. Young helmswoman Neris perched on the cracked wooden pier, her boots scuffed by countless tide-worn decks. As the tide sang its ancient lullaby, a low hum punctuated by the splash of foam against stone, she felt the sea's heartbeat sync with her own. The scent of brine mixed with the sweet rot of seaweed, making her nose twitch like a cat chasing fish. She clutched the helm, half sleepy, ready to hear whatever story the night would spill. Just as she was about to drift into a dream, a flicker of phosphorescent light skated across the horizon, announcing the arrival of the legendary night sailors. These ghostly mariners, dressed in tattered star maps and moon-bleached sails, steer their spectral galleys by the constellations that never set. Think a celestial version of Star Trek's Enterprise, but with more cobwebs. Their oars cut the black water with a sound like distant applause, and their captain, a grinning skull with a jaunty tricorn, tipped his hat in silent salute. Neris laughed, half amused and half terrified, because nothing in her training manual mentioned navigating with a crew of apparitions. Yet the night air carried their tale like an old tavern song, and she listened, entranced. The phantom fleet glided on moon-slick decks, their hulls exhaling the sour odor of rusted iron and old sea foam soap. Lanterns made of fireflies hung from rigging, casting jittery amber shadows that danced on the water's surface like jittery emojis. When a ghostly figure stepped onto the quay, his boots left wet footprints that evaporated before the sand could remember them, a trick that would make even a magician blush. The creaking of invisible rope sang a discordant lullaby, while distant gulls, real or imagined, shrieked a mournful chorus that smelled faintly of smoked fish and spilled ale. Neris felt a cold shiver down her spine, as if the ocean itself had slipped a wet hand into her jacket. Summoning the courage of a rookie pirate on a reality TV show, Neris called out, "Hey, ghost guys, any tips for a landlubber?" The leading specter answered with a wry grin, his voice sounding like a wind chime caught in a storm. "Mind the tides, lass, they're messier than a teenager's laundry basket." She chuckled, realizing the irony of seeking advice from beings who have never needed a compass, yet seem to know every hidden reef. With a dramatic flourish, she hoisted her own lantern, its flame sputtering like an overcooked popcorn kernel, and pledged to follow their starlit routes. The night sailors tipped their ethereal caps, vanishing into a ripple that smelled faintly of burnt incense and pirate-scented shampoo. As the night deepened, the cove's lullaby swelled, wrapping Neris in a blanket of shimmering sound that felt like a grandmother's hug, if your grandma were a sea monster with a penchant for lullabies. She slipped into the helm, feeling the ghost ship's invisible wake push her forward, steering lost souls toward the horizon where sunrise waited like a promise. The salty air now tasted sweet, as if the sea had just taken a sip of honeyed rum. In that moonlit harbor, Neris realized she had become part of the ancient legend, a living compass for wandering spirits. And somewhere beyond the tide's edge, the night sailors whispered a final bon voyage, their echo drifting into the night like a bedtime story you never want to end. Under a sliver of moon that looked like a polished coin, Neris slipped her prow into the night-worn waters. The sky wore a silver crescent, and the sea reflected it in a trembling sheet of glass. She tightened the rope of her dreams and whispered the ancient oath of the sailors of the night. A salty wind, smelling of old fish and distant campfires, tugged at her hair like a mischievous child. Even the gulls seemed to pause, as if waiting for the first note of a haunting lullaby. Ahead, the ocean erupted in a living tapestry of phosphorescent currents, each ripple pulsing with blue-green fire. The water sang in whispers, echoing forgotten prayers that sounded like a choir of babbling monks. Every splash brushed her skin with a cool, electric tingle that felt like the brush of a lover's sigh. The glow painted grotesque silhouettes of seaweed, looking like tangled spaghetti left out in the rain. Neris inhaled the brine, tasting iron and sea foam, and felt the night's heartbeat thrum beneath her boots. From the phosphorescence rose the midnight galleon, a phantom vessel that drifted without a hull, its decks made of mist and moonbeams. Its crew spectral mariners in tattered coats that smelled of mildew and old rum, glided aboard with a creak that sounded like a bad karaoke night. Their captain, a hollow-eyed lieutenant named Grindel, fixed Neris with a grin wider than the Strait of Gibraltar. "Answer our riddles, or be forever lost in a tide of soggy socks," he announced, clutching a rusted compass that ticked like a nervous metronome. The crew chuckled, their laughter bubbling up like sea spume, half menace, half midnight comedy club. The first riddle slipped through the salty air. What walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 at noon, and slides on a slipper at night? Neris blinked, recalling the classic Sphinx puzzle from an old scroll, and shouted, "A human," only to be met with a snort that smelled of old cheese. Grindel snorted, "Close, but I meant the tide itself. It crawls, climbs, then drifts like a lazy cat on a rug." The next challenge glimmered. "I have seas but no water, maps but no land. What am I?" she answered. "A dream." And the crew erupted in applause that sounded like clinking bottles in a pirate tavern, while a lone seagull heckled, "Better than Netflix." With riddles solved, the phosphorescent currents swelled, wrapping Neris in a warm, gelatinous hug that smelled oddly of freshly baked bread. The midnight galleon tipped its ethereal bow, granting her passage through the radiant tide like a VIP pass at a rock concert. Neris felt the sea's resolve seep into her bones, a gritty determination as stubborn as a barnacle on a hull. She laughed, the sound echoing across the moon-lit deck, and promised the ghostly crew a tale for ages, or at least a decent Wi-Fi signal. As the silver crescent dipped lower, the night whispered its final secret. The true treasure is the current that carries you forward, even when it smells like old socks. The night fell like a thief on the deck, stealing the stars and the wind in one silent swoop. Without a whisper, the sea turned a bruised violet, and the rigging shivered as if someone had flicked a switch behind the clouds. The crew, who'd been swapping tall tales about mermaid karaoke, froze when the horizon disappeared into a black velvet curtain. Neris, clutching the helm, felt the deck tilt like a carnival ride gone rogue, while the salty spray turned into a cold, tasting mist. Even the gulls seemed to hold their breath, their usual caws replaced by a mute, ominous hush. From the gloom rose the silent sirens, those mythic beings who trade melodies for nightmares, but tonight they sang in silence. Their forms glimmered like oil slicks, eyes twin lanterns that flickered with promises of sweet oblivion. They drifted around the hull, their hands brushing the wood, leaving a faint phosphorescent residue that smelled oddly of burnt caramel and old parchment. The crew swore they could feel a tug at their thoughts, as if a Netflix binge of endless reruns was about to hijack their minds. With a grin only the sea could muster, the sirens whispered in the language of dreams, urging Neris to surrender to the endless night. Neris found herself caught in a loop of midnight, each second stretching like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. The sky was a blank screen, the stars having taken an unscheduled vacation, and the ocean below churned with invisible, oily blackness. A wave of dread rolled over her, slick with the smell of damp wool and rusted iron, making her throat taste of old pennies. The silent sirens circled, their silhouettes like karaoke judges waiting for a perfect pitch that would never come. She realized the only way out was not to fight the void, but to find a sliver of light that refused to be swallowed. There, half buried in a crevice of the deck, lay an ancient lantern, its glass cracked like a retired superhero's shield, but still pulsing with a warm amber glow. The lantern's light cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing the rusted rivets and the salty grime that clung to the wood like stubborn graffiti. Neris reached out, fingers trembling, and felt the heat singe the back of her hand, a reminder that even the smallest fire can scorch the night. She cupped the lantern, its glow painting her face with a heroic, almost cinematic silhouette reminiscent of a Jedi holding a lightsaber against a Sith's shadow. The silent sirens recoiled, their mute chorus faltering as the lantern's beam turned their whispers into static. With the lantern hoisted high, the vessel sliced through the sound less storm as if it were a rogue wave in a video game cheat code. The crew, now breathing a sigh that smelled like fresh coffee, rallied around Neris, their eyes reflecting the flickering flame like a group of Instagram influencers discovering a perfect filter. The silent sirens, defeated, dissolved into the froth, muttering about the unfairness of humans having better tech than myth. As the sea calmed, the sky cracked open to reveal a shy crescent moon, winking like a mischievous cat in a midnight meme. Neris laughed, the sound echoing across the deck, and promised the lantern a lifelong spot on the mast, because every legend needs a sidekick that actually works. The black tide stretched like spilled ink, and the sky above swirled with a choir of glittering stars. When the great constellations, Orion his belt, the twin brothers of Gemini, and the prow of the mighty Argo, slid into a perfect triangle, the sea seemed to hold its breath. From that celestial intersection, a phosphorescent fog rose, curling around the hull of Neris' battered galley, as if the ocean itself were exhaling a secret. Through the silvery mist the outline of an island materialized, its cliffs etched in moon silver, and its beaches littered with shells that sang like tiny maracas. They called it Nocturna, the hidden isle that only the night-bound could ever see, and it beckoned the weary sailor with a promise louder than any lighthouse. Neris stepped onto the sand, feeling the grit grind between his toes like coarse sugar mixed with sea salt. The air smelled of wet kelp, old wood rot, and the faint perfume of night-blooming jasmine that seemed to rise from the darkness itself. He raised his lantern, its flickering flame casting trembling shadows that danced with the ancient carvings etched into the rocks, scenes of leviathans and moon-capped fleets. Every splash of a distant wave sounded like a drum roll in a cosmic theater, urging him forward toward the island's heart. There, perched atop a throne of driftwood and barnacles, waited the night captain, his silhouette as imposing as a mythic barista who could brew espresso from starlight. The night captain wore a coat stitched from the night's own velvet, threaded with silver filaments that caught the moon's grin. His eyes were twin pits of obsidian, reflecting centuries of sailors who'd bargained with him, their faces flickering like old TV static. A low chuckle escaped his throat, sounding like the groan of a ship's hull under a tempest, and he tipped a hat made of crushed shells that clinked like tiny cymbals. "Welcome, wanderer," he rasped, "to the crossroads where memory meets the tide." He gestured with a hand that smelled of brine and old incense, summoning a veil of midnight mist that curled around Neris like an overdramatic theatrical curtain. "To claim safe passage home," the captain announced, "you must surrender a memory, just one, no more, no less." Neris blinked, recalling the ancient legend that a sailor's happiest moment could be traded like a barrel of rum, a price both generous and grotesquely cheap. He thought of his mother's lullaby, the smell of fresh baked bread, and the sound of his dog's bark, each memory shimmering like a firefly trapped in amber. With a wry grin that would make a sitcom dad proud, he whispered, "Fine, I'll give up the memory of my first failed fishing trip. Those fish were so slippery they could have auditioned for a heist movie." The captain laughed, a sound that rippled through the water, and snapped his fingers, causing the chosen memory to dissolve into a puff of phosphorescent foam that smelled faintly of stale popcorn. As the foam faded, the sea's surface brightened, turning a deep sapphire that glittered like a freshly polished mirror. A gentle current tugged at Neris's boat, guiding it through a corridor of starlight where each wave hummed a lullaby older than any human chart. The night captain tipped his hat once more, his voice drifting back like a distant radio station. "May your voyages be as smooth as a cat's purr on a Saturday." Neris felt the weight of his lost memory settle like a feather, oddly lighter than the ballast he'd carried for years. When the galley finally slipped past Nocturna's shore, the horizon opened to familiar constellations, and the sailor smiled, knowing that even without that one silly memory, the night still held enough stories to keep his eyes wide open. When the first blush of sunrise slipped over the horizon, Neris pulled the woolen cloak off her shoulders and stepped onto the deck, her heart thudding like a drum in a marching band. She had decided, with the stubborn resolve of a pirate queen, to spill her memories into the wind instead of letting them sink like sunken treasure. The ancient night sailors, those ghost mariners who prowled the black tides, lingered in the shadows, their cracked hulls creaking like old leather shoes. As the sky cracked open, their spectral sails unfurled one last time, catching the golden rays before dissolving into mist. The sea, which had roared like a tavern full of brawling sailors, now sighed into a tranquil hush. Dawn painted the world in amber and rose, and the air smelled of salt and fresh coffee. Imagine a seafarer's version of a morning espresso, if espresso could be brewed from brine. Seagulls cackled overhead, their screeches echoing like a medieval rock concert, while gentle waves lapped at the hull with the soft patter of a toddler's giggle. Neris felt the cool dew kiss her cheeks, each drop a tiny pearl of memory she could taste, tinged with seaweed and the faint bitterness of old rope. The deckboards, slick with dew and a stray smear of algae, squeaked under her boots as if they'd heard too many bedtime stories. Even the distant gulls seemed to hum a lullaby, a melodic reminder that the night's terror had been swapped for sunrise's gentle promise. The night sailors, those mischievous phantoms, began to fade like an Instagram filter left on too long, first the prow, then the rigging, until only a wisp of salty vapor clung to the water. Their ethereal voices, which once sang of storms and lost souls, dwindled to a sigh that smelled faintly of old fish markets and burnt incense. Neris watched their silhouettes dissolve, feeling a strange mix of relief and nostalgia, as if her grandmother had finally retired from telling ghost stories. The mist that swallowed them smelled like wet wool and the lingering perfume of a sailor's pipe, a reminder that even spirits need a proper exit strategy. With each ghost that vanished, the sea's surface grew smoother, mirroring the sky's pastel hues like a polished bronze shield. Then, as if the ocean itself had taken up a harp, a low lullaby rose from the depths, humming through hulls and hearts alike. The tune was simple, a rolling, soothing cadence that could coax even the most cantankerous kraken into a nap. It brushed Neris's ears like a velvet curtain, carrying hints of sea spray, kelp, and the faint tang of rum left unattended on a night watch. The melody promised peaceful dreams to all who heard it, as reliable as a lighthouse that never asks for a tip. Even the gulls seemed to sway, their feathers ruffling in time, while a lone crab performed a slow, dignified shuffle to the rhythm. Neris laughed, a sound that cracked the morning's stillness like a pirate's joke about a mermaid's manicure, unexpected, slightly salty, and oddly endearing. She whispered a thank you to the departing night sailors, noting that their exit was more graceful than a superhero's retirement after a dramatic cape drop. The deck, now bathed in golden light, smelled of warm wood, coffee, and the faint promise of adventure yet to come. As the lullaby lingered, it felt like a blanket stitched from moonbeams, ready to tuck the world into a snooze that even the most restless sea dog would envy. And so, with the sun climbing higher, Neris set her gaze toward the horizon, confident that the night's legends had turned into tomorrow's bedtime story. The harbor of Eldermist clung to the night like a damp cobweb, its fog thick enough to choke a horse. Lanterns sputtered amber glows that fought a losing battle against the gray veil. In that murky cradle, Captain Merrill stood on the creaking dock, her coat flapping like a moth's wing in a storm. She called out to the ragtag assemblage of sailors, smugglers, a retired opera singer, and a fisherman who swore his net could catch ghosts. Their murmurs rose and fell with the tide, setting the rhythm for a story that would soon sail beyond the realm of sane navigation. Merrill's crew was a patchwork quilt of misfits, each bearing a scar that sang louder than any war banner. The opera singer, prima donna Vila, practiced high notes that made the dock's rats freeze mid-chew, while the grizzled shipwright muttered about rusty love affairs with hulls that never saw sunrise. A teenage coder named Jax, who claimed to have hacked the galactic GPS of the Starfleet's next-gen cruiser, brought a glowing tablet that beeped like an overexcited heart monitor. Their laughter cracked through the fog, a sound as sharp as shattering glass, but beneath it, a sour whiff of brine and old fish guts lingered, reminding everyone that the sea never forgets. Ironically, the most seasoned among them, a retired pirate who swore he'd once outwitted a kraken, still trembled at the thought of the lost mariner's legend, as if the ghost ships were the ultimate spoiler alert for his life's movie. The lost mariner's fleet had vanished centuries ago, leaving behind only rust-stained charts and a rumor that the ships now floated like phantom whales beneath the moon. Eldermist's tide seemed to throb with a secret pulse, pulling at the hulls with invisible fingers that whispered, "Come back, or stay forever stuck on the dock of doom." Mariel felt the wood of her own ship, the ivory specter, shiver as if it remembered the cold grip of the cursed water, and she slammed her fist on the wheel, yelling, "If those ghosts want a ride, they'll have to book a seat on my deck first." A seagull swooped down and dropped a dead fish on the captain's boots, a wet, stinky reminder that death loves a good punchline. The crew exchanged glances that said, "We're either about to become a legend or a cautionary footnote in a historian's footnote," and the air crackled with the sound of distant, off-key bagpipes, perhaps the mariner's own soundtrack. Legends swirled around the harbor like incense smoke, each tale more embellished than the last, from sailors who claimed they saw the fleet's masts flicker like neon signs in an 80s sci-fi movie. Old Marta, the tavern's barkeep, snorted, "If you think those ships are haunted, you should see my ex-husband's karaoke nights. Those ghosts would be jealous." The wind carried a low hum that resembled a cello's mournful sigh, mixing with the clatter of wooden crates and the occasional splash of a rogue wave that tasted of iron and old tea. Mariel laughed, noting that the only thing scarier than a phantom fleet was the prospect of her crew's morale sinking faster than a leaky bucket. Yet, amid the irony, a shiver ran down her spine as a stray lantern flickered out, and a distant bell told the hour of no return, echoing like the Death Star's ominous whoosh in a far-away galaxy. With the tide turning into a black-inked serpent, the crew tightened their grips, their boots squelching in the muck as if the harbor itself were a giant, angry sponge. Mariel barked orders, set the sails, brace the hull, and for the love of all that's salty, keep your eyes on the horizon, unless you want to see the lost mariner winking at us like a cat meme. The ivory specter lurched forward, cutting through the fog like a knife through butter, while the scent of pine tar and sweat mingled into a perfume fit for a pirate-themed spa. Behind them, the ghostly silhouettes of the vanished fleet seemed to emerge, their hulls glimmering with a phosphorescent glow that made the crew's eyes water like they'd been sprayed with fresh sea foam. And so, with hearts thudding like drums at a rock concert, and the distant, eerie chant of the drowned echoing in their ears, they set sail toward a destiny that promised both glory and the kind of haunting that would make even the toughest pirate check his reflection in a mirror for a ghostly grin. The night sky bled violet as the armada slipped past familiar shoals, the wooden hulls groaning like ancient cats in a sunbeam. Salty spray slapped the faces of the crew, and the scent of wet rope tangled with the faint perfume of distant kelp. Captain Mallory barked orders, his voice cutting through the wind like a razor-sharp sea shanty. Below deck, the men whispered about the map's last line, half-heartedly fearing a misprint rather than a monster. Yet the sea itself seemed to hum a low, mournful lullaby, daring them onward. Suddenly, a phosphorescent glow flickered on the horizon, mimicking the lanterns of their own flagship with eerie precision. Ghostly hulls rose from the mist, identical to the Armada's sleek schooners, their sails billowing with a wind that smelled of old tobacco and forgotten regrets. The sailors gaped, some clutching their cutlasses while others hiccuped in nervous laughter, as if a prankster had swapped their compass for a novelty toy. The spectral fleet mirrored every maneuver, turning the chase into a macabre ballet of wood and wave. Even the gulls seemed confused, circling the phantoms like paparazzi at a celebrity sighting. The crew's resolve cracked like a weather-worn plank when the phantom ships began to sing, low, mournful verses that sounded suspiciously like sea shanty parodies of a 1990s sitcom theme. A lanky deckhand shouted, who ordered the ghostly karaoke, and the tension flared into a chorus of nervous chuckles. Yet the captain steadied his hand on the wheel, eyes narrowed as he imagined the spirits as unpaid interns haunting the office of the ocean. He reminded his men that every sailor's dream is to see shore, and even dead sailors can't cheat that longing. With a grin sharper than a cutlass, he ordered the first watch to fire a celebratory volley, lighting the night like a fireworks display at a pirate reunion. As the cannon's smoke settled, the phantom hulls drifted closer, their timbers moaning with stories of voyages aborted at the first wave. The air grew cold, and the scent of rusted iron and stale beer seeped through the decks, making a few sailors gag and clutch their stomachs. Whispered voices rose from the ghost ships, recounting lost loves, unpaid debts, and the bitter irony of never tasting the promised shore. One spirit, a weathered matron in a tattered coat, brushed a cold hand against the captain's cheek, reminding him that ambition can be a cruel tide. The crew shivered, not from fear alone, but from the realization that they were sharing a midnight cocktail with the ocean's most overdue guests. When dawn finally bruised the sky pink, the spectral armada faded like a bad dream after a double espresso, leaving only the echo of distant creaks and a lingering scent of sea foam and regret. The sailors, drenched in salt and relief, swore to toast the dead with a pint of grog when they finally reached port, if they ever did. Captain Mallory chuckled, noting that even the afterlife enjoys a good mimicry act, much like a blockbuster sequel that pretends to be original. He tightened his grip on the helm, feeling the wood pulse beneath his fingers like a living heart. And as the real horizon stretched ahead, the crew felt the bittersweet weight of stories untold, ready to write theirs before the next ghostly echo tried to rewrite them. The night air hung heavy with salt and dread as the fleet drifted toward the Maw of Sorrow, a black maw that swallowed stars like a cosmic garbage disposal. A thin, otherworldly melody slipped through the rigging, slipping past the sailor's ears like a mischievous mouse. Its notes spiraled over the deck, lilting over the creaking planks and the smell of tar-soaked wool. Even the ship's cat, a scarred tabby named Captain Whiskers, twitched its tail in uneasy rhythm. No one could tell if the tune promised safe harbor or a one-way ticket to the bottom of the ocean. From the fog emerged a siren, her hair a tangled seaweed of green and violet, eyes flashing like broken mirror shards. She sang a promise, safe passage through the maw in exchange for a forgotten oath, a pact sealed with a kiss as sharp as a cutlass. Her voice dripped with venom, yet it smelled oddly of fresh rain on iron, a scent that made the crew's stomachs churn with both hope and bile. She waved a skeletal hand, revealing a tarnished medallion that pulsed like a heart on a broken watch. The air crackled, and the ship shuddered as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Marel, captain of the Gallows Gull, felt his brain wobble like a jelly dessert left in a storm. He recalled an old legend about a captain who traded his soul for a map to Atlantis. Spoiler: the map turned out to be a pizza menu. The siren's bargain reminded him of those late-night deals on streaming services, free trial, then a lifetime of debt. Yet the alternative was watching his crew be devoured by the maw's black tides, a fate as grim as any horror movie marathon. He tightened his boots, his mind a battlefield of duty, dread, and the faint hope of outwitting a mythic diva. Around him, the crew swayed between mutiny and prayer, their faces slick with sweat and sea spray, eyes darting like startled pigeons. The first mate, a burly lad named Brine, spat out a mouthful of salted beef and shouted, "Do we sign the contract, or do we become ghost stories for the next bartender?" The cook, a woman named Goethe, clutched a ladle as if it were a holy relic, her nostrils filling with the acrid scent of burning kelp. Even the ship's figurehead, a wooden mermaid with a chipped smile, seemed to sneer at the siren's offer. The deck resonated with the clash of steel cups and the soft, relentless hum of the siren's tune, a soundtrack for impending doom. At last Mariel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the melody like a sword through butter, and offered the oath he had long buried beneath a pile of unpaid tavern tabs. He whispered the ancient promise, his words tasting like cheap rum and regret, while the siren's eyes narrowed in a mixture of triumph and annoyance. The sea around them seemed to exhale, the maw's black jaws unclenching just enough to let the fleet slip past, though not without a lingering chill that curled around each sailor's spine. As the gallows gull sailed into calmer waters, the siren vanished with a final mocking trill that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke rendition of My Heart Will Go On. The crew breathed relief, only to discover the forgotten oath had bound them to a new, utterly ridiculous duty: delivering ghostly parcels to the underworld's post office. The armada plunged into a vortex that smelled of ozone and old tar, as thunderheads tore the sky like a ripped pirate flag. Lightning laced the clouds, casting a sickly green glow that turned the sea into a jittery aquarium of phosphorescent slime. Waves rose like angry beasts, slamming the hulls and rattling the cannons with a sound that sounded suspiciously like 1,000 clinking beer mugs. The wind howled with the voice of 100 lost sailors, each gust pulling at the rigging like an invisible hand. Even the stars seemed to be rearranged by a mischievous cosmic DJ, dropping beats of dread across the deck. As the tempest ripped reality, the living crew found themselves shoulder to shoulder with the dead, whose translucent forms flickered like bad Wi-Fi. Ghostly sailors drifted through the galley, sniffing at the stale stew and coughing up ectoplasmic foam that tasted like seawater and regret. The deck became a chaotic ballroom where swords clanged against phantom cutlasses, producing a chorus of metallic screeches and ghostly giggles. Sailors cursed the weather, but the dead merely whispered jokes about eternal overtime on the afterlife's night shift. The smell of rusted iron mixed with the sweet rot of seaweed, making everyone's nose hair stand on end. At the heart of the maelstrom, Mariel stepped forward, her boots squelching in the churned-up muck, eyes blazing brighter than a lighthouse on a caffeine binge. Across the roiling foam floated the ghost captain of the original Lost Mariner, his beard made of kelp and his hat perched like a clueless Viking on a windy day. "So you finally showed up," the ghost sneered, voice echoing like a badly tuned banjo. "I've been waiting longer than the wait for the next Star Wars movie." Mariel cracked a grin, replying, "I prefer my ghosts with a side of irony, not just a side of fog." Their duel began with a clash of wills that crackled louder than a popcorn kernel in a microwave. The battle unfolded like a slapstick ballet, swords sparking against spectral blades that vanished on impact, forcing both sides to resort to puns and plundered poetry. Ghost cannons fired bursts of pale light that smelled faintly of old laundry detergent, while Mariel's crew countered with cannonballs soaked in hot sauce, splattering the air with a fiery tang that made the dead cough up more ectoplasmic bubbles. At one point, the ghost captain tried to board Mariel's ship, only to slip on a slick of sea foam and tumble into a pile of rotting barrels, shouting, "This is not the deck I signed up for." Laughter erupted from the living, a rough, hoarse sound that seemed to briefly push back the darkness. Each strike sent ripples through the storm, as if the heavens themselves were watching a particularly dramatic reality TV showdown. When the final blow landed, the tempest shuddered, its chaotic roar fading into a sigh that smelled like fresh rain on a dusty battlefield. The ghost captain's form dissolved like sugar in tea, leaving behind a single silver compass that spun wildly before pointing toward a horizon of calm waters. Mariel hoisted the compass aloft, whispering, "Looks like we finally got a GPS signal from the afterlife." The surviving ship steadied, their sails catching a breeze that tasted of peppermint and possibility. In that quiet aftermath, the crew swore they could hear distant applause, a reminder that even the dead love a good show, especially when it ends with a happy ending worthy of any Netflix binge. The last roar of the tempest died like a tired drum, and the sky cracked open to a pale, forgiving blue. Ghostly hulls, once silhouetted against thunder, slipped silently toward the horizon, their phantom sails folding into the sunrise. In the harbor of dawn, lanterns flickered awake, casting buttery halos on cobblestones slick with sea foam. The salty air, now sweet with the hint of kelp and fresh bread, coaxed the townsfolk from their shutters. Even the gulls seemed to sigh in relief, their cries turning from frantic squawks to lazy, lazy whistles. The surviving crew gathered on the dock, their boots squelching in muck as they knelt before the vanished fleet. They tossed fresh fish heads into the water, a perfumed offering that made the waves grin with bubbles. A grizzled helmsman raised a cracked bottle of rum, its amber glow catching on his weather-worn beard, and shouted a toast to the souls who never saw shore. Laughter cracked like a rope under strain, half-hearted and haunted, as the old sea shanties rose, tugging at memories like tide-pulling ropes. A stray dog barked, then stopped, as if listening for a phantom bark from a ship that never docked. Mariel, the port's self-appointed chronicler, unfurled a scroll as thick as a pirate's treasure map and began scribbling furiously. Her quill scratched like a skeletal hand on a chalkboard, each line a candle-lit confession of the night's absurdities. She wove in a sly nod to Star Wars, typing that the ghost ships had more force than a Jedi's lightsaber, much to the chuckles of the watchmen. The ink smelled of iron and ink, like fresh blood and coffee, mixing with the dock's smoky aroma of burning pine. With each paragraph, the haunted armada seemed to lose its weight, as though a story could pull a phantom into the realm of the living. As Mariel's words settled, the spectral hulls dissolved into mist, their wooden ribs humming a last goodbye that tickled the ears like a distant didgeridoo. The harbor's cobbles, now damp with dew, reflected the sunrise in a glittering mosaic that made the ghosts look like misplaced Instagram filters. Fishermen still clutching their nets felt a cool shiver cascade down their spines, the sort of feeling you get when you realize you left the oven on. Ironically, the ships that never reached port finally arrived in the minds of those who remembered them, earning a piece more solid than any anchor. A stray cat, unimpressed, flicked its tail and sauntered away, as if to say, "Your drama, got it." The day swelled with the scent of fresh pastries from a nearby bakery, mingling with the lingering brine, reminding everyone that life, like a ship, must keep sailing. Mariel closed her journal with a decisive thud, the sound echoing like a cannon boom across the quiet quay. She winked at the youngest deckhand and whispered, "If you ever hear a phantom horn, just blame the Wi-Fi," earning a chorus of groans and giggles. The harbor of dawn settled into a quiet rhythm, its bells tolling a mellow hymn that felt both solemn and oddly sitcom-ish. And so, the ghostly armada, once a nightmare on the waves, found its final birth in storybook peace, leaving only a lingering salty smile on the lips of the living. The library hummed like a giant ant hill, brass coffee pots clanking and air conditioners sighing over stacks of dust-caked tomes. Arya, a wiry teenager with ink-stained fingertips, perched on a wobbling ladder while Captain Idris, her grizzled mentor, muttered about sea charts and rum. Between a rusted compass and a half-eaten sandwich, they uncovered a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a false back of the genealogy aisle. The ledger's pages glimmered with salt-stained ink, promising voyages that could make even Poseidon raise an eyebrow. As they leafed through the crackling pages, 5 vessels leapt out like mythic beasts. A Phoenician merchant galley that first stitched the Mediterranean's trade web, a Chinese treasure junk that rode the Silk Road's watery spine, a Portuguese caravel that dared to hug the Cape of Storms, a British ironclad that whispered the age of steam, and a modern nuclear submarine that turned the ocean into a silent subway. Each entry listed dates, ports, and a single word, revolution, as if the ships themselves were bold graffiti tags on history. Idris chuckled, noting that these ships were the original influencers, before Instagram made it cool to post sunsets. Arya's eyes sparkled. She could already smell the brine, the tar, and the sweet rot of exotic spices waiting in the pages. They packed a battered duffel, a portable scanner, and a ludicrous amount of snacks, because nothing fuels a maritime pilgrimage like gummy bears and stale crackers. Their first stop was the sun-baked port of Tyre, where they tasted the metallic tang of ancient rope and heard local kids yelling yo-ho, while pretending to be Blackbeard. Next, they boarded a replica junk in Guangzhou, where the air throbbed with incense, and the river's mud clung to their shoes like a stubborn ex-relationship. The caravel leg took them to Lisbon's cobblestones, where the salty breeze carried shouts of merchants bargaining over pepper, and a distant accordion playing a fado that sounded suspiciously like a sea shanty remix. Every dock brought a fresh assault on the senses. The ironclad's rust smelled like a dentist's nightmare. The steam hiss sang a lullaby that made the crew's mustaches twitch, and the submarine's interior reeked of recycled air and metal sweat, a scent that could make a dolphin gag. Yet amid the grit there were moments of absurd humor, a gull stealing Idris's sandwich, a tourist taking a selfie with a cannon and captioning it, "Bang, I'm a pirate," reminding them that history isn't just solemn plaques but also slapstick footnotes. The crew laughed when a gull tried to board the modern sub, apparently thinking it was a giant, floating fish and chip stall. Each splash, creak, and roar stitched a tapestry that hinted how these ships didn't just move cargo. They reshaped how humans imagined the impossible beyond the horizon. Back in the library, the ledger now felt heavier, as if the ink had absorbed the roar of wind and the sigh of hulls. Arya closed the book with a thump that sounded like a wave crashing into a harbor wall, her heart still echoing the call of the deep. Idris tapped the cover, grinning. "We've charted 5 ships, but the ocean's still got a million more stories. Just need the right compass and a sense of humor." The library lights flickered, casting shadows that danced like sea foam on a moonlit deck, and Arya whispered that the next chapter would involve a spaceship-like sail, because why should the seas have all the fun? The call of the deep, she realized, was less a siren's song and more a persistent, cheeky nudge urging the curious onward. The sun hammered the Nile's banks like a giant kitchen timer, and Arya squinted against the glare, while Idris swatted a wayward mosquito that smelled of stale reeds. They stepped onto a dusty quay, where the river sang a low, mud-laden hum, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a wooden cart overturning its load of figs. Around them, papyrus stalks swayed, their green tips whispering secrets of a civilization that built pyramids on a diet of sand and ambition. Arya pulled out a scroll, its edges frayed like an old comic book, and announced they were about to meet Egypt's first fleet, the sun-baked reed. The air tasted of hot metal and river algae, a pungent cocktail that made Idris grin like a pharaoh spotting a new heir. The barge itself looked like a giant, sun-tanned reed raft, its hull fashioned from tightly bound papyrus strips that fanned out like a giant accordion. Craftsmen hammered wooden ribs into the reeds, then coated the seams with a sticky mixture of mud, straw, and honey, basically the ancient equivalent of duct tape and caramel sauce. When the wind rose, the vessel caught it like a giant sail sewn from linen, propelling the cargo with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a lazy cat stretching. Its shallow draft let it skim over the river's sandbars without a hitch, while the flat bottom acted as a rolling pantry for grain, letting the barge double as a floating granary. Watching the reeds sway, Arya joked that the design was so clever it could have won Best Sustainable Transport in a modern Oscars ceremony. Soon the sun-baked reed earned the reverent nickname Pharaoh's Highway, ferrying royal barges decked with gold-leafed banners that glittered like a Hollywood premiere on water. Buried beneath the opulent garb, the barge also hauled sacks of barley, wheat, and dates, their sweet scent rising like incense when the boat lurched over a sandbank. This twin-purpose cargo system birthed the first organized river trade, where merchants timed their shipments as precisely as a DJ dropping beats at a desert rave. The barge's predictable schedule allowed villages upriver to exchange pottery for fish, turning the Nile into a medieval Amazon prime of its day. In that rhythmic flow, the ancient world learned that moving bulk goods didn't have to be a nightmare of oxen pulling carts through scorching deserts. If you asked a modern logistics exec whether the reed barge could beat a container ship, they'd probably laugh and say, sure, if the ship's stuck in a traffic jam on the Suez Canal. Yet the ancient engineers had already mastered the art of modular loading, stacking grain in neat piles like Lego bricks, a principle that still underpins today's massive cargo yards. The barge's design was so versatile that it could host a royal procession one day and a midnight fish feast the next, proving that flexibility beats brute force, something even the Avengers would nod to. Idris quipped that the reed hull was the OG green boat, predating any eco-friendly hype by millennia, and Arya replied that at least it didn't need a battery charger. Their laughter echoed across the water, mixing with the croak of frogs and the distant clang of a blacksmith hammering a new reed spear. When the sun finally slipped behind the horizon, painting the sky a deep amber, Arya and Idris felt the pulse of history under their boots, as if the river itself were a living timeline. They realized that the sun-baked reed wasn't just a vessel, it was a seed that sprouted the whole forest of maritime logistics we rely on today. The scent of wet papyrus lingered on their clothes, a reminder that innovation often smells like mud and sweat, not polished steel. As they boarded their own modern craft to leave the banks, they promised the Nile they'd spread the story of the reed barge, because every great odyssey needs a good narrator. And somewhere downstream, a shy cat, maybe the feline guardian of the river, watched them go, tail flicking in approval. The salty wind slapped our faces as we unfurled a parchment that smelled like old cheese and seaweed. Its edges were frayed like a pirate's beard, and the ink, faded to a ghostly brown, marked a single line from the port of Palos to a tiny dot labeled Santa Maria, 1492. We imagined ourselves as Columbus's reluctant understudy, shuffling across the deck of a three-mast caravel that looked more like a squeaky wooden shoebox than a ship of destiny. The hull groaned under our weight, creaking like a tired grandma telling bedtime stories, while gulls cackled overhead, mistaking us for a snack. And just like that, the Atlantic stretched before us, a shimmering blanket of possibilities and terrible storms. On the morning of departure, a chorus of mutinous grumbles rose from the deck, as if the crew had collectively decided that going west sounded like a terrible new diet plan. The ship's carpenter, a wiry man named Diego, swore the keel was cursed, pointing at a splinter that smelled of damp rot and old rum. Columbus, perched on the stern like a nervous director, waved a trembling hand and shouted, "Vamos," while the carpenter muttered a prayer to Saint Brendan, the patron saint of lost sailors who probably never liked being asked for directions. The mutineers clanged their swords against the railings, creating a cacophony that sounded like a medieval metal band trying to tune their instruments mid-concert. In the end, a barrel of cheap wine and a promise of gold, the kind of promise that makes modern CEOs smile, quieted the rebellion, and the Santa Maria slipped away from the harbor with more hope than horsepower. As we drifted into the open ocean, the night fell like a thick blanket, peppered with stars that seemed to wink at us in ancient Portuguese, Spanish, and maybe even a little alien code. A sudden squall rolled in, slamming waves that smelled of brine and rotten fish into the deck, while the crew shouted "Mare," and grabbed at their rosaries like teenagers clutching their phones during a power outage. The ship's mast creaked under the wind's weight, groaning like a teenager's back after a midnight pizza binge, and a lone drumbeat echoed, reminding everyone that a storm was just nature's version of a dramatic plot twist. In the darkness, a lone sailor swore he saw a glimmering serpent, a sea monster that the crew claimed was a sign that the new world would be full of treasure and terrible tapas. The irony was palpable. A humble caravel built for fishing trips now carried the weight of an empire's dreams, all while the crew tried to convince themselves the real treasure was just not getting seasick. When the sunrise finally pierced the clouds, the shoreline of an unknown island rose like a cheap movie set, palm trees swaying to a rhythm that smelled of coconut sweat and fresh earth. Columbus stepped onto the sand, his boots squelching in the wet sand, and announced, "We have found a new world," while the indigenous people stared, their eyes flickering between awe and the question, "Did you just bring more of those dreadful wooden shoes?" The first contact was a clumsy dance of gifts. Polished beads, a cracked brass compass, and a sack of dried beans that smelled like yesterday's socks, exchanged for maize, bright feathers, and a bewildered look that said, "We're not sure we signed up for this." The Santa Maria's hull, still riddled with barnacles and the lingering stench of human sweat, became the accidental embassy where language broke, myths collided, and the first seeds of a global market were sown. Think of it as the original shipping container, but with more rats. History would later call this moment a turning point, though the crew probably just wanted a nap and a warm bowl of stew. Back on our modern deck, the map now curls like an ancient scroll after a binge watch of Game of Thrones, reminding us that every legend needs a dragon, or in this case, a creaking caravel, to make it spectacular. We can't help but picture Columbus as the ultimate first-person shooter of exploration, firing cannons of ambition while dodging mutiny grenades and superstition traps, all without a Wi-Fi signal. The Santa Maria may have been as modest as a budget-friendly minivan, but it propelled an exchange of cultures that still shows up in our tacos, our coffee, and the occasional "I'm a pirate" t-shirt sold in souvenir shops. If the ship had a Twitter account, its bio would read, "Sailing the Atlantic since 1492, occasional mutiny, occasional miracles, always low on fresh fruit." And as we lower the weathered map back into its chest, we hear the ocean whisper, "You tried to change the world. Good luck finding a parking spot at the port of destiny." Varia clutched the brass rail as the gleaming replica of the RMS Titanic shivered into view, its smokestacks puffing like a giant pipe organ ready for a concert. Idris, ever the pragmatist, muttered that time travel insurance never covered iceberg encounters, earning a roll of his eyes. The deck glittered with polished mahogany, brass lanterns casting a warm glow that made the Atlantic night feel like a ballroom in Versailles. A chorus of murmuring passengers in feathered hats and flannel suits swirled around them, each whispering about the greatest ship ever built. The air smelled of salty brine, coal smoke, and a faint hint of cheap perfume, an intoxicating cocktail of progress and extravagance. Inside the grand staircase, Arya's shoes clicked against marble as crystal chandeliers swung like lazy constellations overhead. The echo of a string quartet drifted from the first-class lounge, its violins trembling like a nervous cat on a hot tin roof. Idris poked a gilded banister and noted that the upholstery still carried the faint scent of cigar ash and spilled champagne, proof that even ghostly opulence can get a little tipsy. A nervous steward offered them a glass of the era's finest bubbly, which fizzed with the enthusiasm of a teenager on the first roller coaster. They laughed, realizing they'd stepped into a living museum that somehow smelled like a greasy diner after a midnight pizza run. The night was calm until a silent, hulking mass breached the horizon, its jagged teeth glinting like a villain's grin in a Saturday morning cartoon. The captain's voice cracked over the wireless, "Iceberg right ahead," and the ship shuddered as if someone had yanked a giant cord. Zarya felt the deck tilt, a sudden lurch that tossed cocktail napkins into the air like confetti at a bewildered wedding. Idris's hand tightened around his pocket watch, the ticking a mock metronome to the growing panic. The iceberg's cold breath kissed the hull, and the Titanic's steel skin sang a mournful creak, louder than any brass band. Water rushed in like 1,000 angry puppies, licking the decks with a hiss that smelled of rust and fish guts. Passengers scrambled, their elegant gowns now drenched, turning the grand staircase into a slip-and slide of chaos and squealing shoes. Varia clutched a life jacket, feeling the rubber rub against her skin like a stubborn rubber duck, while Idris shouted, "I told you we should have taken the inflatable duck." The ship's once proud bow began to dip, and the orchestra's violins turned into a frantic screech, as if trying to out-rock the Titanic's own downfall. In those frantic moments, the illusion of invincibility shattered, leaving only the raw, cold truth that hubris can sink even the most glittering dreams. As the Titanic slipped beneath the moonlit waves, Arya and Idris found themselves standing on a ghostly deck, watching history rewrite itself in frothy syllables. The silence that followed was louder than any ship's horn, a reminder that technology alone can't outsail humility. Idris mused, "We've just binge-watched Titanic in 3D, but the ending feels way more soggy." The experience left a lingering taste of iron and regret, a flavor that would stick to their tongues longer than any souvenir candy. They stepped back into their own time, carrying the Titanic's lesson in their hearts. Never let pride fill the lifeboats, and always check the weather app before setting sail. We step back through the fog of centuries, the chronicler's quills buzzing like impatient bees, and stitch the 5 legendary ships into one roaring tapestry. The river prow that once whispered to the reeds now shouts through our modern canals, its paddle wheel echo a reminder that progress never sleeps. From the sleek caravel that pirouetted across Atlantic winds to the hulking steam beast that chugged like a relentless locomotive, each vessel lives on in the steel veins of today's fleets. Even the safety reforms, born of a mutiny-induced nightmare, still clank in every alarm bell and life raft strap. As we anchor this story in our own era, we promise to keep the tales sailing, lest they sink like a forgotten bottle of grog at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Picture the first river ship, a low-drafted timber canoe with a nose as sharp as a chef's knife, cutting through the humid mist of the Nile. The crew swore by the scent of damp mud and the croak of unseen frog choirs, their oars slapping water like impatient drummers at a rock concert. When the vessel hit a hidden sandbank, the men tasted salt and panic, yet laughed like protagonists in a sitcom about misplaced GPS. That riverine rebel taught us that navigating narrow arteries demands both patience and a good pair of rubber boots. Today's inland barges still owe their sleek hulls to that humble skiff, even if they now sport Wi-Fi and an espresso machine on deck. Then came the caravel, a sleek Spanish sloop that flapped its canvas sails as if it were auditioning for a superhero movie. Think Fast and Furious, wind-powered edition. Its wooden ribs creaked under the weight of spices, gold dust, and the salty breath of the Atlantic, while gulls shrieked like paparazzi at a Hollywood premiere. The crew tasted the brine of distant shores and the sweet, yeasty smell of fresh dough from their galley ovens, a comforting reminder that even explorers need pizza. When a sudden squall shredded a mainsail, they patched it with a prayer and a piece of old sailcloth, turning disaster into a dramatic plot twist worthy of a binge-worthy series. The caravel's daring curve still guides today's cruise liners, which now glide with glass-fronted decks but still chase the same horizon-kissed dreams. Enter the steam-powered Leviathan, an iron behemoth that puffed out clouds of coal-black smoke like a dragon on a caffeine binge. Its pistons thumped and hissed, a metallic heartbeat that made every sailor feel like a backstage drummer at a heavy metal concert. The smell of hot iron mixed with the sweet rot of tar, and the deck was slick with sweat, oil, and the occasional wayward biscuit crumb. When a valve burst, it erupted in a shower of sparks that could have lit a fireworks display at New Year's, prompting the crew to chant, "Don't panic. It's just a dramatic entrance." Modern vessels still whisper that steamy anthem, now softened by diesel and electric whispers, but the spirit of relentless power still roars beneath every hull. Finally, the safety reforms, born from a night when a lifeboat capsized like an overcooked pancake, forced the sea world to stop treating danger like a punchline in a sitcom. The clang of metal railings, the sharp smell of fresh paint, and the distant hymn of a ship's horn became the soundtrack of accountability. Our chroniclers, armed with lanterns of curiosity, swear to guard these lessons as fiercely as a dragon hoards its treasure, lest future captains think lifeboat is just a fancy term for a novelty umbrella. They pledge to chronicle each rivet, each knot, each salty tear, ensuring that the stories of these 5 ships sail on, even to the far future seas of interstellar travel. So raise your mug of grog, listen to the waves, and remember. The anchors of legacy are heavier than any gold, but they keep us grounded in wonder. When the first amber rays stretched across the harbor, Captain Elena Marquez tightened her silver cuffs and barked a grin at her ragtag crew. The Aurelia creaked awake like a tired cat, her sails unfurling into the sunrise as if eager for adventure. Elena clutched an old sea shanty parchment, the words of a lullaby that sailors claimed could coax even the wildest currents into a gentle hum. She whispered the opening verses, letting the salty breeze carry the melody toward the open water. The crew, half asleep and half hopeful, answered with a chorus that made the dock seem like a stage for a melodramatic opera. The ocean stretched before them, a shimmering highway of teal and turquoise that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Each wave sang a different note, some roared like a brass section, others whispered like a lullaby mother birds croon to their chicks. Elena felt the deck vibrate beneath her boots, a tactile reminder that the sea was a living chorus, not merely a root. The salty sting of spray pricked her eyes, while the smell of brine and sun-baked wood mingled into a perfume only explorers could love. As the Aurelia slipped into the swell, the crew swayed to the rhythm, believing the water itself was guiding their compass. Mid-journey, the first mate, a wiry lad named Tomas, joked that the lullaby sounded suspiciously like a pirate remixed TikTok trend. Sea Shanty Remix 2023, coming soon. Yelena rolled her eyes, but the crew laughed, their chuckles bubbling up like foam on a cappuccino. An albatross swooped overhead, eyeing the ship as if auditioning for a cameo in a Disney sequel, The Voyage of the Feathered Friends. The crew's grumbling about mutiny turned into a spontaneous sing-along, their voices rising in a discordant yet oddly charming harmony. Even the gulls seemed to join, squawking off beat verses that made Elena wonder if the birds were paid in breadcrumbs. The irony was palpable. They sought a soothing lullaby, yet the sea delivered a chaotic jam session worthy of a summer blockbuster soundtrack. By noon the sun beat down hard enough to melt the wax on the ship's candles, leaving a sticky residue that clung to the sailors' palms like cheap chewing gum. A sudden surge of foam crashed over the bow, drenching Elena's boots and flinging a torrent of sea lice onto the deck, causing one of the deckhands to erupt in a hysterical sneeze that echoed across the hull. The smell of rotting fish off a stray net mingled with the sweet scent of citrus jars the cook kept for morale, creating a nauseating but oddly comforting perfume of expedition life. Elena's hands, scarred from years of rope work, slipped on the slick rail, sending her heart thudding like a drumbeat in a war film, only to be caught by the strong arm of her first mate. The Aurelia shuddered as a rogue wave slapped her side, reminding everyone that the ocean, while lyrical, could also be a merciless bully. As the day faded into a violet twilight, the lullaby's verses settled into the hull like a warm blanket, easing the creaks and groans of the aging ship. Elena stood at the helm, eyes reflecting the dying light, and whispered the final line of the shanty, feeling the water respond with a soft sigh that seemed to approve. The crew, now hushed, listened to the sea's own applause, gentle splashes against the hull that sounded like distant applause at a theater. In that moment, the Aurelia became more than wood and canvas. She turned into a living storyteller, carrying its passengers toward the unknown with a melody that promised both safety and adventure. And somewhere far off, a siren, if such a thing existed, might have smiled, knowing her dawn song had finally found a willing audience. Mid-voyage, the Aurelia shivered beneath a sky that bruised itself purple with gathering clouds. A sudden squall cracked the air like a cannon's bark, lashing the mainmast until it sang a metallic groan. Rain struck the deck in a staccato rhythm, splashing salty foam into the crew's boots and soaking their woolen coats. The ship lurched, then lurched again, as if a giant invisible hand were shaking a dice cup, and the men's shouts rose like a choir of startled seagulls. Fear slithered through the rigging, tightening around the sailors' ribs like a rope-tightened corset. Old Mateo muttered curses in a dialect that sounded like a broken accordion, while the cook, a burly man named Biff, cursed the soup that now tasted like sea foam and regret. The gun deck swayed, making the powder barrels rattle like maracas at a carnival, and even the ship's cat, Sir Whiskers, leapt onto the helm, eyes wide as if he'd just seen a Netflix-style plot twist. Yet amid the chaos, the crew clung to the wooden railings, their breaths forming ghostly clouds that vanished as quickly as their hopes. From the bow, a lanky youth named Tomas stepped forward, his navigator's cap askew like a jaunty pirate's hat. He was the kind of kid who could read the stars faster than a teenager scrolls tick-tock, and his fingertips tingled with the memory of a lullaby his grandmother whispered on rainy nights. He recalled verses hidden in old sea shanty scrolls, words that spoke of moonlit tides and the ocean's soft sighs, a melody so gentle it could coax a whale into a lull. With a grin that hinted at rebellion, Tomas whispered, "If the sea wants to sing, we'll give it a verse to hum." He lifted his voice above the howl, singing the lullaby's forgotten lines into the wind as if it were a secret password for the deep. The notes rose, warm and honeyed, weaving through the rain like a silk scarf slipping through a storm-tossed doorway. Slowly the waves seemed to hesitate, their fury flattening into a rhythmic pulse that matched the cadence of his song. Even the mast, battered and trembling, settled into a gentle sway, as though the ship itself were nodding off to a bedtime story. The crew, eyes wide with disbelief, clapped their hands to the beat, feeling a strange, comforting tickle along their spines. For a breathless moment, the Aurelia floated on a sea that had turned from beast to lullaby, a brief truce sealed by melody. The darkness above retreated, leaving a silvered horizon where moonlight brushed the water like a lover's fingertip. Tomas lowered his voice, and the sea exhaled, releasing a sigh that smelled of brine and burnt incense, hinting that the lullaby held a deeper, ancient power. The men laughed, half in relief, half in awe, realizing they had just witnessed a myth waking up on deck, a whisper from the deep that would echo through tavern tales for centuries. And so the Aurelia pressed onward, its hull humming with the lingering notes, as the crew whispered back to the ocean, "We're listening, dear deep, keep the lullabies coming." The golden siren creaked under the weight of a dozen salty souls as she slipped into twilight, her masts sighing like an old man's cough. A cartographer's compass spun madly, pointing to a smear of green on the horizon that no map had ever bothered to ink. Captain Marlowe squinted at the sea, muttering that the gods must have misplaced their GPS. The crew whispered legends of a hidden archipelago where the moon kisses coral and fish sing lullabies. Little did they know the ocean was about to hand them a lullaby with a dangerous beat. When the reefs emerged, they glowed like underwater neon signs, each coral polyps flashing in time to a low, humming chant. The water smelled of brine and sweet kelp, a perfume that could coax a mermaid out of hiding. The lullaby throbbed in the hull, making the planks vibrate as if the ship herself were humming a nursery rhyme. Even the parrots on deck fell silent, their squawks swallowed by the rhythmic pulse. It was as if the sea had turned into a giant, bioluminescent metronome, and the crew were the bewildered dancers. The first mate Jolly tried to steer clear, but his foot slipped on a wet deck, and he skidded straight into a tangle of seaweed that felt like a soggy weed whacker. The reefs rose like the teeth of a jealous giant, jagged limestone jutting out to bite any careless hull. Sailors shouted warnings that sounded suspiciously like Netflix trailers. Don't go gentle into that deadly lagoon. The ship's carpenter, armed with a trusty axe, began whittling away at a rogue coral that threatened to nail the keel, muttering that this was not the kind of spike he'd expected in his vacation brochure. By sunset, the crew earned a new nickname, the Reef-Riddled Rookies. Amid the chaotic dance, a weathered stone slab rose from the sand, its surface covered in strange glyphs that glowed faintly under the coral's pulse. Navigator Elsie ran her fingers over the carvings, swearing they read like an ancient karaoke lyric sheet for the sea. The crew gathered, each trying to translate the verses, while the captain wondered if the song was a warning, a lure, or just a cosmic prank. As the tide rose, the verses sang back, echoing the lullaby with a hint of sarcasm, as if the ocean itself were mocking their ambition. Doubt settled in like a barnacle on a hull, making some wonder whether they'd been lured into a watery version of a haunted house. When the final chorus faded, the reefs dimmed, and the sea fell silent as a library after closing time. The crew stood on deck, soaked to the bone, realizing the lullaby had been a test, a watery audition for the role of humble listeners, not conquerors. Captain Marlowe, ever the dramatist, declared that they had become the chorus of the deep, an odd tribute to a song that none of them could actually hum. A chuckle rippled through the crew, because nothing says "mission accomplished" quite like a chorus of soggy sailors humming off-key. And so, with a splash of irony, the golden siren turned homeward, her sails now tuned to the faint, lingering hum of the coral's forgotten lullaby. The sky over the archipelago boiled over like a cauldron left on high flame, a black column of clouds spiraling down with the ferocity of a dragon that had just been woken from a centuries-long nap. Waves roared like a tavern full of drunken sailors, slamming the Aurelius hull with the weight of 1,000 cannonballs. Elena felt the deck tilt, the wood splintering under the pressure, and the smell of brine mixed with the dank, rancid scent of wet rope. The monstrous hurricane, the fiercest ever recorded, snarled toward them, its eye a cold, smug eye socket of stillness. Even the gulls seemed to quit their gossip and stare, as if the world held its breath waiting for the ship to shatter. Zelina bellowed, her voice cutting through the howl like a conductor, shoving a frantic orchestra into harmony, and ordered every soul aboard to join in the ancient lullaby taught by her grandmother. The crew, half shivering, half sober, snapped to attention, their throats rasping the low, seaweed-laden melody that had once soothed newborns on distant Caribbean decks. Somewhere in the chorus, a gruff sailor muttered, "If this doesn't work, we'll have to start singing Baby Shark to calm the waves," earning a snort from the cook who was still polishing his last year's rum bottle. Their voices rose, clashing with the storm's roar, weaving a thick, humming veil that felt like warm wool thrown over a metal furnace. Ironically, the chant sounded more like a karaoke night on a pirate ship than a solemn prayer, but the absurdity only made the sound stronger. As the refrain grew, a palpable shiver rippled through the timber, the Aurelius planks humming back like a giant resonating drum. The wind, which had been a snarling beast, seemed to pause, listening to the human chorus with grudging respect, its gusts softening to sighs that smelled of wet pine and old incense. The veil of song wrapped the ship in a luminous cocoon, faintly shimmering with the colors of sunrise, gold, pink, and the occasional flash of a startled fish. Elena could feel the vibration under her boots, a gentle thrum that steadied her own heartbeat, making the terror of the tempest feel like a shaky ride on a carnival coaster that was suddenly switched to a lazy river. The crew, eyes wide, tasted the salty spray now tinged with the sweet aftertaste of song, and even the most hardened mariner found his knuckles unclenching. Soon the hurricane's fury slunk away, transforming into a lazy, rolling sigh that rocked the Aurelia like a cradle in a nursery. The sky cleared just enough to reveal a crescent moon winking at the ship, as if it were a cheeky night shift supervisor giving a thumbs up. Waves now lapped gently, whispering jokes about the storm's overdramatic exit, while the deck smelled of wet cloth, burnt wood, and the faint aroma of Elena's favorite tea, chamomile, which she claimed could calm even a kraken. The crew, still humming, swayed in unison, some chuckling that they had just survived a scene straight out of the Avengers, but with more sea foam and fewer sequels. In the quiet aftermath, the lullaby lingered in the air like a perfume, promising safety until the next tide of chaos. When the night finally settled, Elena stood at the helm, her hair slick with rain, and raised a toast with a dented brass mug to the sea, the wind now a polite gentleman tapping his cane. The Aurelia glided onward, its deck humming with the remnants of the chant, echoing like a 90s boy band reunion tour that never quite left the harbor. The crew, eyes half closed, imagined themselves floating on a giant, musical mattress, dreaming of distant ports where the only storms would be the ones brewing in coffee houses. Elena's smile was as sharp as the ship's prow, knowing that a simple human song could tame even nature's most temperamental diva. And so, the night's lull turned the tempest into a gentle sigh, sealing the chapter of those brave souls who sang their way through history's worst hurricane. The last thunderclap melted into a sigh as the Aurelia slipped into the cradle of a hidden bay, its hull humming a contented creak. The water, now a glassy mirror, reflected the crimson sunset like a spilled bottle of sangria. Masts drooped, sighing relief, while the crew, still smelling of salt, sweat, and the occasional overcooked hardtack, exhaled in unison. Even the gulls, those feathered critics of every voyage, circled lazily, as if checking the ship's Instagram feed for likes. In the distance, an ancient lullaby floated on the tide, its notes trailing off like a forgotten bedtime story. Captain Marlowe lowered the anchor with a clang that sounded suspiciously like a gong announcing a royal arrival. The gentle rocking of the ship became a cradle, and the crew gathered on deck, listening to the lullaby's echo fade into the evening tide. Miriam, the ship's cook, tossed a handful of fragrant jungle herbs into the fire, sending a sweet, earthy perfume up through the night air. A nervous cabin boy, who had been chewing on a piece of rubber shoe for luck, let out a sigh that could have been a prayer or a burp, hard to tell. The lullaby, now a whisper, slipped into the palms of those standing on the sand, promising calm after chaos. Soon the island's inhabitants emerged from bamboo huts, their skin painted with coral dust and stories etched in tattoos. Elder Tui, whose laugh sounded like a conch shell, greeted the newcomers with a basket of fermented fish that smelled like the sea and a hint of old socks. The explorers traded a brass compass for a woven mat, then sang the lullaby in a chorus that made the fireflies perform a synchronized light show. Children chased the echo, their giggles mixing with the croak of frogs that seemed to applaud the performance. At one point, a shy teen tried to rap the lullaby, throwing in a line about, "Yo-ho, let's roll the tide," and the crowd roared as though they'd just seen a medieval mixtape. With cheeks flushed from song and sea spray, the crew pledged to carry the ocean's lullaby back to distant ports, like a Spotify playlist for the age of exploration. They swore on a half-eaten coconut that no future storm would drown the melody, because even the fiercest gales respect a good bedtime tune. The captain, tapping his weather-worn hat like a metronome, promised to name the next ship Dreamwave, a nod to both the lullaby and the latest sci-fi craze. The islanders laughed, wondering if the explorers would ever master the art of humming while battling a Kraken spoiler. They probably wouldn't. Yet everyone toasted with mugs of sour palm wine, sealing the promise with a clink that sounded suspiciously like a cymbal crash in a cartoon. As darkness draped the bay, lanterns flickered like fireflies on caffeine, casting warm amber shadows across faces softened by peace. The Aurelia's sails were furled, but the crew's hearts stayed unfurled, humming the lullaby as they drifted into sleep. Even the wind seemed to hush, wrapping the harbor in a blanket of quiet that smelled faintly of brine and fresh mango. When dawn stretched its golden fingers, the explorers rose, each step a promise that the ocean's song would travel beyond horizon and headline. And so, with a wink to the gods of travel and a sly nod to future voyages, they set course for home, cradled by a lullaby that would never truly fade.